Good morning, everyone. I am so happy to have everyone here this morning. My name is Mei Yi, and this morning I have here with us Mariam Ghani from Tropical Rainforest Conservation Research Center. It's always difficult to get the name right, but welcome.
Thanks so much, Mei.
Yeah, I'm very excited that Mariam is here today because we have spent 3 sessions talking about climate change. For the most part, we talk about how to reduce putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, reducing emissions. But what about greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere? We already have a lot of that. So this is where we have Mariam coming in to talk about the importance of carbon sinks, and she's going to talk about that and how that will help to pull greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. That's really, really important. And I am excited that you get to see this different aspect of what it means to be working on climate change. Mariam also has a very exciting story to tell about her work with Trcrc. And before we start, I just want to give a brief introduction about what we are doing. This is called the Work in Progress series, where we bring professionals from different industries to talk about a topic that is current. So we have talked about coronavirus vaccines before, and currently we're talking about climate change. We hope that from hearing about the work that the professionals do, that you can understand a little bit more about the world, a very complex world, but very fascinating. And it gives you a better understanding of what other people are doing around the industry. Okay, and this is brought to you by Weekend Academy. Weekend Academy is a school where we also bring professionals to teach children about the different industries out there so that you are better able to discover your interests and nurture your talent and pursue the things that you love doing. So this is an online series that we're doing currently, given that everyone is at home. Hopefully, we can continue to do some of this series, even though our schools are reopening really soon in March. And we can continue to talk about topics that are current. So children, good morning. And if you are here today, please say hi to us. Let us know that you're here. Again, as always, there is the chat box there. So if you are if you have any questions, you have any comments, use the chat box. Good morning, Ajimula, and good morning, Yuvashri. So good to have you this morning with us. And that's all the introduction I'm going to say. I want to pass the time now to Mariam. Mariam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mei. Great, my slides are already up. This is wonderful. So hi, everyone. My name is Mariam, and I work with the Tropical Rainforest Conservation and Research Center, also known as Trcrc, and that's why I'm going to be calling it because it's too much to say. And I work there as the Stakeholder Engagement and Communications Manager. And I'm so excited to be here with you today to chat with you about working in conservation. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I do, why I do it, and how I do it. So thank you so much, Mei Yi and Weekend Academy, for this opportunity, and to you all for joining us on this Saturday morning as part of this series on climate change. So I've watched a couple of your previous videos, and I know that you've heard from some really cool speakers already, right? You've got Professor Azizan, who talked to you about the science of climate change. You have Mr. Hakim, who's here today. Hi, Mr. Hakim, who talked about renewable energy. And you also had Dato' Dennis last weekend talking about electric vehicles. So I'm going to talk to you today about how Trcrc is tackling the climate crisis, both in Malaysia, as well as in the whole ASEAN region, so in all of Southeast Asia. So first of all, I want to ask you guys, why do you think that protecting nature is so important? I know, you've heard from so many different people about this, but why do you think? So maybe put some of your comments in the chat box and I'll read them in a bit. But for me, nature really provides us with everything, right? From the soil to the trees to the air that we breathe. It gives us food, it gives us water, shelter, health, wealth, biodiversity, animals, right? It's really quite endless. But with the rapid development that we're experiencing and the population growth, we're really pushing nature to its limit. So nature is a finite resource, means that the more that we take of it And the more that we destroy, the less we have of it, and it doesn't just regrow itself, right? And so I'm going to bring back this slide that I saw from Mr. Hakim's talk on renewable energy, because I really liked it. I think it was a really good breakdown of the issue. So this is an illustration of carbon emissions and carbon sinks, right? So carbon emissions is the release of carbon, aka greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere, and it's the leading cause of climate change. And so on the other side, you have a carbon sink, which is basically anything that absorbs more carbon from the atmosphere than it releases. So for example, you've got plants, right? Through photosynthesis, they absorb carbon and they store it. You've got the ocean as well, and then you have soil. So on the left-hand side, those are all the things that humans are doing to emit carbon into the atmosphere. So you have things like electricity production, food and agriculture, industry, transport. So, you drive a car, even when you build your houses, all of these things emit carbon into the atmosphere. And then on the right-hand side, we have our current sinks. So what carbon is being taken out of the atmosphere? What is taking carbon out of the atmosphere? So unfortunately, 59% of the carbon stays in the atmosphere. So that's not a good thing. But 24% and 17% are being kept in land sinks and in coastal sinks. So I'm going to talk to you about land sinks today. So how do we go about protecting nature? So I'm going to talk to you about a term that you're going to hear all day long today, which is conservation. So conservation is the act of caring and protecting the Earth's natural resources so that they can persist for future generations, so yourselves and maybe your children's children, really long term. And this includes maintaining the diversity, which means the variety of species, genes, and ecosystems. So conservation also helps to maintain the functions of the environment. So some examples of that include giving us water to drink and to shower, to protect us from floods, and to take out all that nasty stuff, all that carbon from the air, as well as other pollution. So what is the difference between conservation and preservation? So I'm going to give you a breakdown of all these terms, right? So how does it fit into the bigger picture of protecting our environment? So I like to think of it kind of like a spectrum. So you have this, arrow, and on the left-hand side, you've got preservation. In the middle, you have conservation, and on the far right, you have exploitation. And preservation is basically when you want to keep nature as is. So you want to restrict all humans and all vehicles from entering, so it's left completely untouched. And then on the far right, you've got exploitation, which is when you just take and take and take from nature without thinking about what will happen when it's all gone. And then right in the middle, we've got conservation, which is when you realize that nature and humans exist together. We need each other, but we cannot just take and take and take and leave nothing for future generations. So we use nature responsibly. I'm going to give you an analogy that makes me laugh, so bear with me. But who here likes dessert? Do you like dessert? I love dessert. So I'm going to think about nature as, say, a really big birthday cake. Okay. What flavor do you guys like? Chocolate? Chocolate? Okay, it's chocolate. So on the one side, we have preservation, where we believe like the cake is just so beautiful. We don't want anything to happen to it. So therefore, no one gets to eat this cake. Don't even touch it. Okay. Leave it alone. And on the opposite side, with exploitation, we've got, say, one person who decides, you know what? I'm going to eat all this cake, all of it by myself. I don't care if there's no more cake for anyone else because I want it and I want it now. So that's not so nice, is it? And then in the middle, we have conservation, where as a group, we want everyone to try this cake because it's just so good. So we all take a tiny piece, just enough, but we don't take it all. We keep some, we figure out maybe what is the recipe for this cake? How can we make more cake? So that now everyone gets to enjoy cake and all our future generations get to try this cake as well. So I think it's clear that I really like cake. So yeah, an example of preservation is like a nature reserve where no one is allowed inside. So it's kept as pristine as possible. And an example of conservation would be, say, a community forest, where a limited number of people are allowed inside to enjoy the forest, but they want to keep it as nice as possible. So they also plant more trees so that it keeps regenerating and more future generations also get to enjoy it. And then exploitation would be, say, when a logging company cuts down a whole forest, but doesn't do anything about it to replenish what they took. So even though their, conservation and preservation sound a bit similar, conservation seeks the sustainable use of nature so that we use what we need to survive, but we only use what we need because we don't want to exploit it and do permanent damage to the environment, right? Whereas preservation, keep it as is, so that everything grows as if we weren't here. And then exploitation, something we really want to avoid, meaning we take and take and take and never give back. So the key concept here is that we want to live with nature, allowing it to do its functions of regulating water and cleaning the air. Okay, so I hope that made sense. Ooh, so quick quiz time for you guys. What types of carbon sinks are there? I'll give you 10 seconds to answer. You can put your answers in the chat box. Anyone? Okay, so we've got land sinks, and then we've got coastal and ocean sinks. Oh yeah, sorry, do you guys have any questions for me? Feel free to put it in the chat box, and I'll answer them as we go. Okay, so the reason that I've explained these concepts in detail and bringing in my cake analogy is because at Trcrc, we believe in a really practical approach of combining both conservation and preservation, because humans still need to survive by using the resources from the environment, but we need to use it responsibly. And while we do that, we want to ensure that the untouched part of nature is still able to stay that way. So both conserve and preserve at the same time. Because like I said, we can't survive if we just keep taking and taking and never giving back. And so what we do at Trcrc is to both conserve and preserve rainforest plant species to maintain our forests. We aim to spread awareness, like how I'm talking to you today. And we also want to find solutions to our problems through sustainable development. And so this word comes up a lot as well, which is so the word sustainable, which is where we want to avoid using up all of nature's natural resources to keep a balance in our ecosystem, which means that everyone gets to eat cake. And so Trcrc has 4 major programs, but for today, especially because we're focusing on land sinks, I'm only going to talk about 2, which are TRLC, which stands for the Tropical Rainforest Living Collection, and then People for Peat, which is another program that we're running. Okay. All right, another quiz time for you. What are these trees? Does anyone know? I'll give you a hint. They are the tallest trees in the forest. Anyone? Well, they are called Trcrc. I know that kind of sounds like they're a Pokemon, but I can assure you they're a lot more powerful than Pokemons, and I'll tell you why. So they make up, Trcrc as a family species of trees, they make up about 80% of our forest canopy. And so the canopy is that area that's highlighted over there. So it makes up the bulk of the forest, and it gives a lot of structure to the whole forest ecosystem. It's such an important habitat for flora and fauna. So that's where a lot of animals, birds live and make their nests and get their food from. And the sad part is 56% of Trcrc are threatened because of logging. So people are chopping them down to make buildings, to make all sorts of things. And so what else is special about these trees? It's quite a mouthful to say. Even I have trouble saying the whole Latin scientific name, which is Trcrcaceae family. So as I mentioned, they make up such a big part of the forest canopy, but they also have really, really long reproductive cycles. So what that means is that they only reproduce every 5 to 7 years. So imagine if it took you 5 to 7 years to be born. That's a really long time, right? So another special thing about them is that their seeds are recalcitrant. Now, what that means is that these seeds cannot be stored, whether they're dried or frozen, which means that as soon as the seed comes from the tree and falls to the ground, it'll germinate, meaning it'll start to grow instantly. So that forms what is called like a living seed bank. So you can't, collect all these seeds, keep them, and then plant them later. No, they're gonna grow right now. So I'm gonna show you a short little video about how TRCRC does the work that we do. Let's see. All right. Sorry. So now you've watched the whole video about the process of collecting seeds all the way up to from scouting them to seeing who's fruited, well, not who, which trees are fruiting when, and then going all the way to the forest to collect them. And then you've seen the germination process and then the replanting process as well. So that's kind of the whole picture of what we do. And this process takes quite a long time, especially when we are growing the trees. It takes about 2 years to grow them up. Oh yeah, I wanted to show you this slide. So you watch all those. My favorite part of that video is when they pull the tree, right? They use a kind of like a slingshot to shake the tree a little bit, gently, of course, and all the seeds fall down. Isn't that so beautiful? And so that has a lot to do with the name Trcrc. So a little Greek lesson, bonus, is that I'm going to tell you why it's called a Trcrc. Because in Greek, di means two, pteron, kind of like a pterodactyl, the dinosaur, right? It's got wings, so pteron means winged, and then carpus means fruit. So when you put them all together, you've got Trcrc. So all of those trees that we saw, once they're ready, the baby trees get planted in 2 of our sites. We have one in Perak near the Belum Forest Reserve, and then another one in Merisuli, Sabah, near the Dunham Valley Forest Reserve, if you've heard of it. Both really beautiful places. And so I have another quiz for you. What does Trcrc mean? I just told you. Does it mean it's a type of Pokemon that can fly? Is it a flower species species native to Borneo? Or is it a tree family species, meaning two-winged fruit? Anyone? I'll give you 10 seconds. Oh, you guys know so much about plants already. This is really great. Okay, the answer is two-winged fruit. There you go. Okay, so now we've talked about our tropical rainforest living collection program. So that relates to land sinks in a way that all the trees that we're planting, all the forests that we're trying to reforest, that takes out carbon from the atmosphere and stores it into the soil. So that's a form of carbon sink. So now I'm going to talk about a different kind of sink through a program called People for Peat. So who here remembers how terrible the haze can be in Malaysia? I know there are some years that they even had to close schools because the haze was so bad. So I work for a program called People for Peat, and this is all part of TRCRC. It's quite a mouthful. It stands for the Sustainable Use of Peatland and Haze Mitigation in Asean. And so it's a program that's funded by the European Union. So the European Union is a government body that has taken a lot of time to realize that haze is a massive problem and they really want to help. So this is how they're doing it. So our organization is part of a coalition, which means that we formed a group with two other organizations based in Indonesia called the World Resources Institute, as well as the Sustainable Trade Initiative. And together, we've been working together for the last 2 years. Our program is going to run for 3 years, and we've got a really big goal. And that goal is to reduce fires and haze in the ASEAN region, because that's just terrible, right? Like, I'm sure many of you have experienced it, and I'm going to talk about even why it's so terrible. So this slide, I'm bringing it back. One of my favorite slides. It also kind of looks like a rainbow, so it's quite cute. But so we're going to focus again our attention on land sinks. But first of all, I'm going to ask you, what is peat? That's a word that you're going to hear all day today. And I mean, before I started working here, I didn't know that much about it either. But ultimately, peat is the layer of soil that consists of partially decomposed organic matter derived mostly from plant material, which has accumulated under conditions of waterlogging, oxygen deficiency, high acidity, and nutrient deficiency. And so again, I'm going to play you a video which gives you a really in-depth explanation on what peat is.
This is a healthy peat swamp forest, and this is peat. Peat consists of the remains of fallen trees, branches, leaves, plants, and other carbon matters that have built up in waterlogged conditions for thousands of years, forming a peat dome. It rains a lot in the peat swamp forest. The flat land, forest cover, and sponge-like nature of the peat ensures that the peat remains wet all year round, stopping the decomposition process. And so carbon remains locked in its solid state, happily ever after. Until someone comes along with a chainsaw, cuts down some trees, and digs a trench to flush the timber out of the forest. Water that was previously stored in the peat starts to flow out the ditch. For the first time, large amounts of sunlight enter the forest. The temperature goes up. The organic carbon matter near the ditch is drying out. Oxygen enters the peat, and the peat begins to decompose. Solid carbon turns to carbon dioxide, traveling up and away. At this scale, the impacts are relatively small. The peatland forest will continue to store vast amounts of carbon and also provide important goods and services for the local communities. It's when you go large scale that everything changes. Bulldozers and excavators cut through the forest. Large canals and trenches drain the peatland and make way for the transport of timber and other products intended for planting in the future. Water flushes out of the peat dome.
Sustained drainage causes the water table to go down. As a direct result, the peat dome starts to subside. The added elements of sunlight and oxygen cause the release of carbon dioxide. Seasonal peat fires further accelerate the process, sending vast amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This not only affects the local area, but the greater environment.
Okay. So that gave us a really good, I think, understanding of peat, why it's formed. I'm going to go a little bit more into that. So about thousands of years ago, we had all these large water bodies, right? And naturally, around large water bodies, you have trees, you have shrubs, and so that's what forms these landscapes. And over time, as you saw in that video, dead plants fall into the water body, partially decompose, and then become peat. And so over a long period of time, this peat starts to form a dome because like a sponge, it absorbs water, expands, and remains wet. And then more vegetation starts to grow, so more trees start to grow over that peat dome, and then a whole unique ecosystem is created, and that ecosystem is called a peat swamp forest. And so why is peat so important? I'm going to show you a little demonstration here, because I think it's been mentioned before, right, that peat kind of works like a sponge, which is what I have here. And so it helps to absorb water. So let's say it's flood season, right? Monsoon season in Malaysia, we have that a lot. And so what happens is, you know, as water goes all over through the rains, the peat does its ecological function is to absorb all of that water, okay? And so when it absorbs that water, it also filters out pollutants, and it's really crucial to protect us against floods during the wet season. And then during the dry season, when there isn't any rain at all, this sponge is holding all that water from before. And so this water is now supplying water to all the surrounding plants during dry season. So it's really, really important. And also, when it stays wet, it's a very effective carbon sink, meaning all that carbon, like you saw in that video, is stored in this. And when it's wet, it's locked in the peat soil. However, when you start to cut open the sponge, right, the peat, it starts to drain. So all that water starts to drain out, and then it becomes dry. The peat becomes dry. And when the peat becomes dry, that's when carbon starts to be released into the atmosphere. And then even more scary is when it gets burned. That's when we get peat fires. And peat fires are quite dangerous because they burn underground. So it's really difficult to, you know, have normal firefighters come in and just douse water. It doesn't work that way because it's burning underground. So that's why it's so important to keep peat wet. And so I mentioned, you know, it keeps the earth cool because it stores all this water for us, and it keeps the carbon in the land. So because it's a land sink, a carbon land sink. And so by doing that, it helps to reduce carbon emissions and slow the rate of global warming. So as you can see in this little diagram here, when the earth is really hot, it gets really sad. When it's cool, it's happy. So that's what we want, right? We want to mitigate climate change. And so another reason why peat is really important, similar to how other forests are really important, is also home to a lot of different animals, threatened species of animals specifically too. So we've got orangutans, proboscis monkeys. You know what those are? It's this monkey right here with a really funny long nose. Then there's also things like leopards, tigers, cats. Otters too are in peatlands, as well as Asian elephants. And Asian elephants are just slightly smaller than your African elephant. And so why is peat important to us, especially in Southeast Asia? And that's because we store in Southeast Asia 56% of the world's peat. That's a lot, right? That's half of all of the world's peat. And this one is hard even for me to wrap my head around. But if we think about all the soil carbon, all the carbon stored in the soil in the whole world, okay, 42% of that is stored in peat. That's, again, almost half of all soil carbon is stored in peat, whereas peat only makes up 3% of the world's land area, which means a really small amount of land, but a really large amount of carbon is stored in it. That's why it's really important. And so what happens when peat isn't protected? So as we mentioned, carbon emission is the biggest one, right? Some stats that I can give you is that, so for every 100,000 hectares, and 1 hectare is about 2 football fields, so it's a big amount, but for every 100,000 hectares that are drained, 550,000 tons of carbon is released. So that's almost 5 times the amount of carbon to the space that's being used, right? So that amounts to haze. And when we use the word transboundary haze, that means that if, say, in Malaysia, our peat is burning, right? This affects people all the way to Cambodia, all the way to Myanmar, all the way to Laos. So even though we did this thing, everyone gets affected. And that's really bad, right? So we really want to stop this from happening because we can't control where the haze goes. The haze blows where the wind goes. So we want to make sure that we don't do that. Because haze pollution is really dangerous to us. Because of all this carbon and other burning fuels, is estimated to cause over 100,000 deaths per year in Southeast Asia, which is a lot, right? We don't want that to happen. And in 2015, we experienced a really, really bad haze season. That's because there was a lot of peat burning, both in Indonesia and in Malaysia. And that is estimated to have caused $16.1 billion in economic losses. So people had their lands burned, schools closed, all sorts of really, really bad effects happened. And so we really want to stop that from happening, right? So as I showed you before, in Southeast Asia, we hold 56% of the world's tropical peat, and that amounts to 23,000 hectares. So all these are huge numbers. So it's really hard for me to even envision how much that is. But like I said, if you think about 1 hectare being the size of 2 football fields, and you times that by 23,000, that's a lot of peat in Southeast Asia, right? So how are we doing to help this problem? So we know that haze is terrible, right? We've seen the effects of it, and we know why peat is so important to stop those effects. So how are we, as People for Peat, tackling this issue? So first of all, we've got these 3 pillars, okay? Data and information, business and investment, and outreach and advocacy. So for the first pillar, we know that there is just so much research out there in the world about peat. Okay, there's so many researchers who are really, really passionate, even more passionate than me, if you can imagine, about peat. But not all of that research that they've done is available. Maybe it's only in the Thai language. Maybe it's only in Malay, right? So what we hope to do is to create kind of like a library, right, of sorts, to make that information more accessible to people, everyone who's interested in it. Right? And we also are bringing researchers together to nerd out about peat, kind of like what we're doing today. Okay. And then the second pillar is where we have sustainable business and investment. So as you saw in that video, many people end up burning and draining peat. And that's not because they're mean or they're evil, but that's because often they don't have any other choice. Okay. They need money to feed their families. And they think maybe the quickest way to do that is to just drain the peat that they live on so that they can plant food, they can plant crops to sell. So this isn't wrong, right, to want to feed your family, but we hope to share more sustainable ways to do business on peat so that it doesn't have to drain the peat, but it conserves the peat for all its important functions. So we really want to provide alternatives to people so that they can do things, like I said, more sustainably in a way that doesn't harm the environment. Okay, and then the last one that we have, and this is as a communications manager, this is kind of where my role comes in especially, which is outreach and advocacy. So how many of you heard about peat and knew about its importance before today? Anyone? No, right? Even myself, like before I started working here, I didn't know much about peat at all. But that's why it's so important to spread awareness about how important these ecosystems are so that everyone can play a part in protecting them. So now, on to being in peatlands. So this was really fun. Back in September, I got to visit an actual peatland because I had never been before. So this was right here in Peninsula Malaysia. We went down south to Johor, where we visited the Air Hitam Peat Swamp Forest Reserve. And Air Hitam in Malay means black water, because as you can see that picture on the right there, that's peat water. And so what color is it? It's actually black, right? And so the reason why it's black is because peat forests and peat water have high levels of organic matter, of acids, like I mentioned before, it's an acidic condition, and tannins. And tannins are kind of the compound that you find in your tea, right? So your tea is also brown, so is the peat water. And I also got to ride an ATV, not on peat itself, because peat's a very sensitive ecosystem, so you don't really want to disturb it in that way, but I rode on the main roads. Not very good at it, but I try. So this is really fun. We got to go in the four-wheel drives, we got to check out what the peat looks like, and we also got to do a little tour with one of the researchers from the university. This was a Tun Hussein On University, who was talking to the community, not just us, but to people who live in that area, who live on peat, to share with them the importance of it, like I'm doing with you today, and also why they should conserve it and why they shouldn't burn it, why they shouldn't drain it. Yeah, Sidratul, I wish you could visit too. I think maybe when the MCO is done, that's something you can organize at some point, because it's really, really cool to visit. We also, as part of the outreach and advocacy that our organizers, this wasn't done by us, this was done by another foundation, but they also ran a photo contest because, like I said, peat is such a good area for biodiversity. So we had people taking photos of all the different cool insects that they found on peat, as well as the different flora and fauna, so the little flowers and things like that. It was really fun. And then lastly, over there on the right, the professor was showing us their research center. And so this picture of water coming down, remember I told you how peat water is kind of like tea colored because it contains tannins, it contains acid, it contains organic matter. So I'm going to show you a check dam. So in areas where development has already occurred on peatland, so meaning, say there's a plantation, right, that's growing pineapple or palm oil. So they've already started to develop on peatland. So this is no longer preservation. It's already maybe conservation, erring on the side of exploitation, but let's try not to get it there. So peat check dams work to regulate the water flow, to prevent over drainage of water during dry season, and to protect against floods during wet season. So as you can see in that photo, on the left, you've got this structure that contains the water and then a kind of like a hole to let excess water flow out. And then if you look really closely, I don't know if you can see, but on the left of that blue check dam, there's kind of like a ruler, and that is to measure the water levels that we want to maintain for the peatland area. So for example, when it's rainy season, all the excess water can flow out, and during dry season, it doesn't flow out, it stays within. Yeah. Okay, so gonna go back to quiz and questions time. And I know I didn't stop to ask you if you had any questions for me, so I'm gonna do that now. But my question to you is, what can peat be compared to in terms of an object in your house? Can it be compared to a birthday cake, or a sponge, or an air conditioner? So I'll give you a moment to answer, and in the meantime, maybe I'll answer some of your questions. So where do Sidratul Muntaha asks, where do greenhouse gases come from? So good question, Sidratul. So earlier we showed you that video, right? Where specifically the gases that we've been talking about is carbon. So carbon comes from emissions. So emissions happen through all of the industries that we do, right? So when we make food, for example, by doing agriculture, carbon gets released. When we take a car to school, we use fuel for that, right? And the fuel, once it burns to run your car, that also releases carbon. So all of these are considered greenhouse gases, and they get released into the atmosphere. So they're considered carbon emissions. So I hope that answered your questions. All right, Bo Sunhues says sponge. Season also says sponge. You're right. It is sponge. Excellent. Good job, you guys. You've been paying attention. So Yuvashri asks, what is coastal? So coastal means typically by the sea. Okay, so when you have an ocean body, next to it you have a coast. So that's what coastal means typically. So when we talk about coastal sinks, we're usually talking about sinks that are close to the sea, close to bodies of water. How long do greenhouse gases last in the atmosphere, Sidratul asks? I actually don't know the immediate answer to that question, but I believe that they stay in the atmosphere for a really, really long time. And that is why climate change is happening, because we have the atmosphere, and then when carbon gets released, it's being stored in that layer between Earth and space. And that's what's warming up our planet. Okay, thank you guys so much for your questions and your answers. You guys are really killing it today. It's great. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to this question. So we've talked so much about peat, we've talked about rainforest living collections. So how is all of this possible? How is conservation possible? Who does this? Who does all of this work, right? And also who pays for all of this work? So I'm gonna answer the first question of who does all of this work. So at Trcrc, we've got the HQ team, which stands for headquarters, which I'm a part of. We work mostly in KL. And there's about 10, 15 of us who work in KL, and we do a lot of office work where we are writing proposals for grants and things like that, or we're doing studies. So a lot of desk work. And then I kind of showed you before, we have our ground team. So you saw in that video earlier, the people who are scouting for seeds, who are pulling the seeds down, who are collecting the seeds, and who are planting the seeds. That's considered our ground team. And then we have community members as well. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we get the community involved in all of this work. And so who else could do this work? You? I think so, and I hope so. I hope today gives you an idea of what you could do, potentially work in conservation. And so I mentioned our ground team before, right? So we run a youth skills training program with our ground team because we believe that conservation is all of our responsibility, right? Everyone has a role to play. So we work with youth in disadvantaged communities, especially, to provide them with skills. So we train them in skills of like how to plant seeds, how to spot seeds, how to identify trees so that they can work in the conservation industry. Because again, it's everyone's responsibility, right? Everyone should have a role to play here. And so that also helps them with future employment, whether they work with us at Trcrc or they work with the forestry department. They have a lot of potential to work in this area, which is great. More people should work in conservation, right? And so I think Mr. Hakim asked a question, whether we work with Orang Asli people. And we do, because we believe as well, like who would be better to take care of our land than the Orang Asli or in the indigenous communities, because they've been living on the land far longer than we have, right? And they have so much knowledge, so much traditional knowledge about it. They know the forest like the back of their hand, right? They've lived there for so long. So we at TRCRC have been collaborating with specifically the Jahai Orang Asli community in Perak, so that we learn from them. We learn how they go into the forest, what they do. And in turn, we share our knowledge in developing seedling nurseries. So through this program, we develop these partnerships where the Jahai communities, they go out and do some seed collection themselves because they're so naturally good at it. And then we help them develop seedling nurseries. So when they do that, they take their seeds that they've collected and they can plant them within their communities, because again, you can't store those seeds, right? They have to be planted immediately. So they plant those seeds in their nurseries, and then we have a program where we buy it back from them. So all this creates a sustainable livelihood while benefiting all of our forests. So it's really a win-win situation here. Sidratul asked me, is that a question for me, what my name is? I'm Mariam. So the next question that we asked, this is to answer the question of who does this work. Now, who pays for all of this work? So there's a lot of work to be done, as you can see, right? So how we get people to pay for this is through corporate sponsorships. So for example, we partner with a lot of corporations. So for example, we have Sime Darby, which is a property developer. We also have Nestle, which is a food company, right? Who makes your ice cream, who makes your Milo. So those are corporate sponsorships, and they partner with us to say, I want to do some good. And then we also have government grants and private grants as well. So grants are kind of like a bunch of money that people put aside to do something good with. And so they give us that money. We have to apply for it, of course, but that's where we get our money from. Kind of like the program that I was telling you about, People for Peat, that's sponsored by the European government. So the European government decided that peat's really important to conserve, and therefore they found us and they gave us this money to say, you do it. We also do environmental consultation. So that means a lot of my colleagues go out into the field sometimes to do some studies, say, for example, in an area where someone wants to know what kind of animals live here and what kind of plants live here, and is this an important place to conserve? So my team will go in there and do an assessment to see, to answer all of those questions, right? And so that's environmental consultation. And then we also have our seedling program, like I mentioned before, where we have all our seedlings, and sometimes we share that with communities who want to plant local native trees in their area. So, okay, what are people doing to offset all of their carbon emissions? Because we saw that we do so much to emit carbon into the atmosphere, right? And so like I mentioned before, right, Nestle is a partner that we have. So like I said, they make ice cream, they make Milo. But as you recall from that rainbow slide, food production contributes to 24% of carbon emissions. That's a lot. If you just think so innocuous, right? You're eating ice cream, but do you realize your ice cream is contributing to 24% of the carbon emissions? So that is just part of it, right? We can't stop eating food. That's impossible. So last year, Nestle, which is the producer of all this really tasty food, pledged to offset their carbon emissions by planting 3 million trees over the next 3 years. So this will help, like I explained before, because the trees work to take out the carbon from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis. So they've partnered with TRCRC along with other organizations as well to help plant these trees, okay? And so another sponsor that I mentioned before is Sime Darby. How many of you are familiar with Sime Darby? I think it was originally an agricultural business, and it's now also a property developer, which makes buildings. And so you know from, again, our carbon emissions slide that both agriculture and buildings contribute to a total of 30% of carbon emissions. And that's a lot. So Sime Darby has partnered with TRCRC to build the Elmina Rainforest Knowledge Center. And this center will help to conserve endangered, rare, and threatened species in our nursery to preserve biodiversity. It's also going to work as an environmental education center. So when MCO is over, right, and we open this center, kids like yourself, I would love to have you there actually to come visit the Rainforest Knowledge Center to learn more about conservation, maybe even get your hands dirty, right? Plant some seeds yourself, plant some trees. So that will be really fun, I think. And so it also helps to provide local employment to people around that area. And it's also a center where a lot of our research team can be based so that they can go out into the forest and they can do maybe a biodiversity study, right? To again, figure out what plants and animals are in that area. And then lastly, we also will, because we'll be growing our seeds from there, we'll be able to supply Sime Darby's neighborhoods with local native trees to create green spaces in urban areas. All right. So these are just kind of like a list of some of our funders, both in the past as well as now. And I'm sure you recognize some of these names, right? So we've got Sime Darby, we've got Bo, so they make your tea, your teh tarik. They make the tea that you drink that. We also have a lot of banks, because a lot of banks try and make green or sustainable choices, right? They want to have sustainable programs. We have National Geographic, which is really cool. It's a nature channel. I'm sure you've probably watched a video from them before. Some energy companies and some oil and gas companies, because both energy and oil and gas are causing a lot of emissions. So they always try to offset that by helping us out with our lancings. These are also some of our partners, so organizations that we work together with, so other research organizations, some universities, some volunteer organizations. And so an important part of all of our partnerships is to go beyond just money, right? Don't just give us money, right? We want for you to have a very practical and action-oriented approach. So all of our funders, when they partner with us, they also learn about conservation through experience. So these photos show some tree planting activities that they've come and done. Sometimes we take them out into the forest to show them how beautiful it is with some of our ecologists. So this is what we do with our partners, so that everyone, again, has a part to play in conservation. Okay, so now we get to talk about me, which is, I guess, okay. But I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, right? Like, how did I land a career in conservation? Well, first of all, when I was a kid, exactly your age, I was really lucky because my parents always took us out hiking and camping. So I learned from a really young age how important and how beautiful nature is. And when I was really about 12 years old, I met one of my older neighbors, and he was about 10 years older than me, and he worked for a nonprofit. So they were dedicated to fundraising for emergency relief for the victims of the 2004 tsunami. You guys probably weren't born yet, but there was a really terrible tsunami in 2004. And so I met this person who was spending his whole life trying to make other people's lives better, right? And I was so inspired by that, by someone who's trying to create positive change in the world, that I decided that I too would work for a nonprofit when I grew up. And when I was in school, kind of like with you, my favorite subjects were English and biology. And then when I went to college, sociology was my favorite subject. So let me know what your favorite subjects are. Maybe we have the same favorite subjects. And so just a brief one, sociology is the study of society, okay, how it functions. And I specifically studied the sociology of creating social change. And so from there, that's when I started working. And so this is just like a brief overview of all the different organizations that I've worked for over the past 10 years. So while I was in college in Malaysia, I was a volunteer teacher at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in KL. And I was teaching kids just like you, but these kids happen to be from Myanmar. And I really enjoyed that experience. It's really fun to talk to kids, right? And so when I went to university, I started working as a fundraiser. So that means I was raising money for different programs. So I raised money for education programs for people who are homeless. I raised money for scholarships. And from there, I really learned how to manage projects and manage events, right, as a coordinator. And so after I graduated from university, my first job out of university was finally with a nonprofit, right? That's what I always wanted. And so I worked with the Canadian Red Cross, and I divided my time between disaster management and volunteer management, because that's very interlinked, right? Because when there's a disaster, for example, when there's a flood, you need a lot of volunteers to help with the cleanup, to help with getting people to safety, all of that stuff. So I managed to learn how to manage crises and to keep calm under pressure. And then after I finished there, I went on to work for a fundraising agency. So a fundraising agency is a business that helps nonprofits make money for their programs. So it was a for-profit company, and I worked with all of these different nonprofits. It was really cool because I got to work with nonprofits working in homelessness, working in conservation, working in education, in hospitals. I got to work with a variety of people and a variety of things. And that's where I learned how to be an effective communicator. And the importance here is because you really, as a nonprofit, need to share your stories of change, right? Because otherwise, how do you inspire people to give you money? But also, how do you inspire people to make change for themselves? And from there, I went on to become the manager of that company. And that's where I led leadership and management. And then when I finally returned from Canada, I came back to Malaysia because my family is here and I love this country. I got involved with Trcrc as the Stakeholder Engagement and Communications Manager. So what I learned from all these experiences is that nonprofits really need communicators, okay? So I'm going to show you just some of my experience going from office, because I've worked mostly in offices and I still work in an office or a home office. But I'm so lucky because when I first started, I got to have a taste of what it's like to work in the field of conservation. So I took a trip to our tropical rainforest living collection in Banun in Perak. So I showed you that slide just now. So I got to actually visit. So you see that photo there. Isn't that just so beautiful? That's a photo of the Balong Forest Reserve. And so the second photo you see, of course, is when you go to a forest. I want to be real with you. When you go to a forest, there are all sorts of creatures, right? And one of those creatures are leeches. And it's just part of being in a forest, right? It's inevitable. Rainforest, there are always going to be leeches. But really, I would say that they're quite harmless. I got bitten by a leech, but it didn't hurt at all. You know, they're just a little bit hungry. Just let them have some food and move on. So don't worry about it if you ever get into conservation. And then on the right-hand side, you can see this photo, right? So those are photos of seeds. But can anyone guess where these seeds came from? Anyone? So they're kind of dirty, right? Why are these seeds so dirty? Well, we partnered with an organization and they're called MEME, M-E-M-E, and they work in the forest with elephants. So they go and they track elephants to find out where they're going, what they're eating, how they're doing. And so they know that we collect seeds and we know that they track elephants. And so guess what elephants eat? They eat lots of fruit. And so what happens when they eat the fruit? They poop out the fruit. And what's left in their poop is these seeds, specifically tree seeds. And so we've partnered with this organization to take all those elephant poop seeds and to plant them in a specific plot called the MEME plot. It's dedicated to all these elephants so that we replant the forest with all these seeds that we know that elephants like to eat. So yeah, that's a fun little project that we've been working on. And who can spot what is in this photo? I saw that was me in the car. I took this video and there was an elephant right there. It was so close and they're so huge. But it was really, really cool to see the kind of biodiversity that happens in the forest, to see the huge mammals, right? Super cool. And then on the right there is just, for me, a beautiful video of nature, because I think that nature is really worth protecting. So to wrap this up, I've kind of shared my journey with you, because I want you to know that change starts with you. So I'm going to give you a really, really quick sociology lesson of how social change happens. And so it starts at an individual level, okay? Say that you want to make change. So you start doing something like recycling, okay? And then you tell your friends and you tell your family about it. And they too think it's a good idea. So that idea then spreads to your classroom. So now everyone in your class is excited about recycling. And to your neighborhood. So now your whole neighborhood sets up recycling bins. And soon your school has a recycling program. Your businesses realize that communities love to recycle, and governments start to put in laws in place to ensure that everyone starts recycling. So it went from an individual, that's you, to your community, so your neighborhood, your class, and then it went on to collective society, so government, schools, businesses. And that's how you create change. And I just want you to know, like, it's as simple as just you doing something about it, right? So I'm going to pull out this quote from Mahatma Gandhi, which I'm sure mostly adults are very familiar with, but maybe you don't know it. It's called "Be the Change You Wish to See in the World." And that's by Mahatma Gandhi. So that I really take that to heart for myself. And now that I've talked to you extensively about conservation, and I hope you've gotten excited about it, what are some careers that you could do in conservation? Well, I work with such a diverse team of people, and they're so talented and they're so fun to work with. And I'm sure you could easily be one of them at some point. So I work with ecologists. So ecologists are people who study plants and study the environment and animals as well. So if, say, you're really good at science, you're really good at biology, and you just have a really strong interest in plants and animals, this could be you. And then I work as well with environmental scientists who study the whole function of the environment, the science behind how it works. So maybe these people studied some chemistry as well as some biology. They definitely do like their science. I work with engineers as well who try and develop innovative ways of saving the environment. I work with business leads. So one of my colleagues is trying to help us develop more sustainable businesses. So maybe your interest is more in business and more in terms of making people do good with their business. That could be for you. And I have to acknowledge my graphic designer, of course, who's helped make all these beautiful slides that you saw today. That was my graphic designer. And so if you are really into arts, right, you love painting, you love design, that could be a career path for you as well. We, of course, have fundraisers, which is my background, as well as communication specialists, because say if you are really good at writing, you're really good at English or Malay, you could be a communication specialist. And yeah, Sidrato was really interested to study about nature. So there you go. You could be an ecologist. You could be an environmental scientist. There's so many things you guys could just do. So this is great. Okay, so to really wrap this up now, how can you get involved? So after talking today, I hope that this has given you some excitement and some interest in conservation, but what can you do, right? So first of all, I think the easiest way, again, it starts with you, right? You can start volunteering in your community. I mean, I don't mean that necessarily with us at TRCRC. You could do anything within your community. Say you notice a lot of rubbish, start picking up that rubbish. And then soon, starts with you, then your community, then society. So that really starts change to happen. And also when you volunteer, say you do volunteer with TRCRC, for me, that really helps to define for you what your passion is, right? I'm really passionate about the environment. I'm really passionate about people, and I've learned that from working. And so as 10 and 11 and 12-year-olds, you don't have to work yet, but you get to volunteer. And so that helps you determine what you like. So say you worked with TRCRC, or say you volunteered with TRCRC, and then it's all about trees, as you know, but then you realize when you're out in the forest, what you're really excited about is birds, perhaps. And so you could go on to study birds. So this gives you an opportunity to really find what your passion is and go with that. So I hope that you would do that. And a really easy thing to do, of course, today is that you could share what you've learned about peat, about trees, about carbon with your friends and family, because that's in itself a form of activism. And so when you do that, when you share what you've learned, when you share your knowledge, that is conservation, right? That's part of conservation. And so I really hope you end up doing that today. And then lastly, this is one of my colleagues reminded me to tell all you guys to do this, Ganesh, which is to make sustainable choices. So I've shown you before some of the partners that we work with, right? They, as big companies, are trying to make sustainable choices. So try and support businesses that are trying to offset their carbon emissions, right? And the other way you can make sustainable choices is to use, again, only what you need, right? So save on water, save on electricity, save on food, don't waste anything. Because that's how, you are literally conserving things. And so that kind of concludes my spiel today. And I hope you guys learned something. And I hope you guys go out and do something about it, because you can be all the change that you want to see in the world. So thank you so much for listening. All right, so I guess I'm going to answer a couple of questions. This is a good question from Yuvashri. If the greenhouse is on fire, what will happen? I'm going to interpret this question as if, say, the peat was on fire, I'm going to assume. So if peat is on fire, what happens is all this fire gets released into the atmosphere, all this carbon gets released into the atmosphere, causing further climate change. So that's no good. Yeah. Okay, another question. What can you do if you volunteer for TRCRC? That's a really good question, Sun. So a lot of the time we get our volunteers to do a number of things, and it also depends what you're interested in. But a basic thing that we have volunteers do is sometimes do some tree planting. That's a really common one that people do, to come and help us plant the trees, or to help process the seeds. So sometimes we get those Trcrc seeds, right, which are those two-winged fruit. So we have volunteers sometimes come in and open up the fruit, so it gives us the seeds, and collect those. So those are some things you could do. And if you really like writing, you could help us write some things for TRCRC. Lots of stuff you could be doing. Thank you for asking. Isn't greenhouse gases just part of a natural cycle? That's a really good point, Sidratul. And to an extent, everything has carbon, right? And everything releases carbon. Even us breathing, we release carbon, right? Are we bad? No, not inherently bad, because we breathe carbon. So yes, it is part of a natural cycle. But where the issue lies is when we do things. So, we cut down so many trees, or we use too much fuel and release more carbon. It's when we do too much of that stuff that it's not a natural cycle, and that we're doing an excess of carbon. Now there's too much carbon in the atmosphere. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Mustard Seed asks, is there any way to remove the carbon before it becomes CO2? I'm assuming this is in reference to peat itself. I'm not very well versed in that technology. I believe that I've read about some technologies that are trying to store carbon, specifically, not in a natural way, but in an artificial way. But there are risks involved, because if you were trying to suppress carbon in an artificial way, it could leak potentially. So that's not something I'm very well versed in. But what I am versed in is the natural way to store carbon, which is through trees, which is through peatlands, conserving those things.
Okay. Thank you so much for spending the time with us to explain all the work that you do, for explaining how all these carbon sinks work. It's really exciting. And I'm so excited to see that so many of the kids, so many of you who join us here today, you have all these different dreams and aspirations about what you would like to do. So that's really exciting. Thanks once more for being with us here today. We have the next session on climate change again, where we're going to talk about agriculture. So Mariam talked about how much agriculture is contributing to greenhouse gases, but then there are innovative ways of doing agriculture so that we can produce more, but with less emissions. So I hope that you have learned something useful and fun today. Thank you for being with us. And thank you, Mariam, for making the time to explain all of the work that you do. So with that, I hope to see everyone again next week. And thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Kate. Bye.